Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. I hope everybody's here to hear about healthcare and security and compliance and not about Twitter. I will not be talking about Twitter. I'll be talking about healthcare. And I appreciate you making the trek over. There was a little bit of a last-minute scheduling change. So before I get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Joe Corkery. I lead our healthcare and life sciences product team in Google Cloud. And we'll be talking about security and compliance in healthcare. No. This worked before. It doesn't work now. Oh. Hello. But yeah, the clicker's not working now. Oh. Is it working now? Let's see. Now it works. OK, perfect. All right. So as many of you know, millions of patients have been affected by data breaches in the past year. And what you're seeing on the screen now is just a screenshot of the site at HHS where you have to go and report data breaches as well as being able to go and look at various data breaches that have happened. If you spent any time there, you'll be surprised by the large number of data breaches that happen. And most of them are relatively very small. A few patients here and there. Sometimes a lot of it relates to someone losing a laptop that had information on it. But there are a number of very large data breaches that happen as well. Ultimately, this reinforces the concept that the threat is real. Healthcare organizations tend to be attacked more than twice the frequency of other organizations out there. And you might ask, why are healthcare organizations such a prime target? And there are a couple of reasons for this. I'm going to start off. The first one is really the rich data that is healthcare data. Healthcare data tends to be very valuable, both in terms of volume and the content that it contains. And in particular, when you think about medical identity fraud, it often takes a very long time for that to be detected. Oftentimes, when medical data is stolen, people sit on it for years before they actually take advantage of it. So there's a real high value to this data. Hospital systems are also at risk because they depend heavily on legacy systems, and they're often slow to update that infrastructure. That's often due to the fact that these systems are validated systems, and they are working with systems that have gone through very specific processes for compliance reasons, for patient safety reasons. So it's not a trivial matter to upgrade these systems. But because of that, they don't get patched regularly. They have a tendency to get lost in the ecosystem, and so these updates don't happen with the frequency that they should. And lastly, and importantly, downtime affects patient safety. And this is an issue with, if you're not able to access your EHR system, if you're not able to access other healthcare technology, it actually puts patients at risk. And as a result of that, healthcare organizations are much more likely to actually pay ransoms to get access back to their system than another organization that might be willing to or able to tolerate that level of downtime. As a result of this, cybersecurity is becoming an increasingly important focus area in healthcare. One of the things that I'm hearing more and more frequently from healthcare organizations is that they're looking to cloud to help them with security instead of being afraid of security on cloud. Security is a real differentiator in the drive to cloud because of this, the extensive time and effort that we invest in security in the cloud. So what I'm going to do now is I want to talk a little bit about how Google Cloud is addressing security, compliance, and healthcare across the spectrum of Google Cloud products. For those of you who are not as familiar, so Google Cloud really encompasses multiple product areas. There's Google Cloud Platform, which is our infrastructure and platform as a service capabilities. We have G Suite, which are their productivity and collaboration tools, as well as Chrome and Android, which provide endpoints for which you'll be accessing this data. And Google Cloud offers a nice end-to-end story for security where you can have secure endpoints with the devices, Chrome, Android. You have G Suite as that operating layer in which you're interacting with your data, sharing your data, and then your infrastructure running on GCP. So you have this nice security focused infrastructure from one end of the spectrum to the other in terms of how your data is handled and moved around. I like this slide because it emphasizes sort of the traditional thinking around data security. Historically, most people like to think that The best way to be secure is to build a very hard wall around everything. And then once you're inside that wall, it's assumed you're okay, you're trusted, you have access to everything. The problem with that is once you penetrate that wall, you have access to all the soft, squishy stuff in the middle without having to do any other authentication or approach. And Google takes a very different approach to this. They, leveraging this concept of zero trust computing where you have to be authenticated at every level of the platform. It's not just once you're inside the network perimeter, you're trusted. You're never trusted. You always are having to re-authenticate. As we think about that, I want to dive into a couple of different areas for the rest of the talk. I'm going to start off by focusing on what we're doing in the world of protection. So how are we building out the infrastructure? How is it being designed and operated to prevent threats? I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the different controls that are in place and some of the capabilities that exist on top of the infrastructure to help you manage your own security settings. And then I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about compliance, and in particular, healthcare compliance. One of the things Google really operates on is this mindset that we want to do defense in depth and at scale and by default. So we are not relying on that soft shell exterior to protect you. Everything from the hardware infrastructure to how we deploy services to how we do storage to identity management to the internet communications and operational device security, that all has a security focus embedded throughout. It's always at top of mind and done by default so that it's easy for you to operate. As part of that, we purpose-build pretty much our entire hardware infrastructure. And we do this so that we can have provenance of our hardware from the bottom of the stack to the top to ultimately reduce the chance of a vendor-in-the-middle attack against your environment. And what we have on the screen right now are highlighting some of the different pieces of the stack, starting from like purpose-built microcontrollers to servers, storage, network, and data centers. At any given time, Google is one of the largest server manufacturers in the world, and that's solely in the purpose of building servers for ourselves, not actually selling servers to other people. I believe it was last year at Next where we announced Titan, which was this purpose-built microcontroller that is used to provide a hardware root of trust for all the machines and peripherals in our cloud infrastructure. Google's networking infrastructure is also an important area in our security. And I say this so there are lots of data centers around the world. And each one of those data centers is connected to each other by Google's own private fiber. And what that means is that when you have data that is moving from one data center to another, it is not traversing the public internet, limiting the exposure of your data outside. So when the only time the data is traversing the public internet is when it's going from the nearest point of presence to your local machine. So very limited exposure outside of once you get outside. Encryption is on by default. This is one of the expectations that you see in HIPAA compliance is that all your data should be encrypted at rest. We just do this by default. Any data that you bring to the cloud is encrypted at rest all the time. No work required. And then as we get back sort of a little bit further up the stack, thinking about endpoints. So with Chrome and Android devices, you have these tools that are universally available. They have tightly integrated security services, and they think about security management on device. A lot of those primitives are just built in. And when you couple that with Chrome browser, which has capabilities for auto updating, safe browsing built in, there's a lot of network security built into the Chrome browser as well. You get a lot of that effort, really security protections out of the box with very little effort. One of the nice features about the Chrome browser is you can actually have the security settings for your browser sync across all instances of your identity. So if you have multiple devices on which you're using Chrome, but you're logged into Chrome with the same identity, you have the same settings everywhere. So you're not always having to worry about, did this laptop get out of sync with my desktop or my phone? I want to spend a little time talking about Chrome and healthcare because I think this is actually a really important value proposition in terms of data security. When we think about today's healthcare worker, everybody's obviously very security conscious and aware of the implications and the dangers. But people are, most healthcare organizations are also fairly budget conscious. There's operating on very tight margins. Increasingly, the workforce is much more tech-enabled, wanting to have access to a wide variety of devices in hand as they move around from patient to encounter. And as part of that, as you're seeing with the digitization of healthcare, they need access to all of these, all their files and their other administrative systems from any place that they're located. And as part of that, you have, a need for mobile devices. When you have, caretakers going from room to room, when you have visiting nurses at home, people doing, off-site visits, there's this need for mobility, but that's combined with security and access to these resources. Chrome browser, as I mentioned, is one of those components in that space. It has a lot of capabilities built in to protect against phishing attacks, malicious sites, malware, with the capabilities of Google's safe browsing. Chrome OS, it's a security-focused OS and an easy-to-manage computing platform. Well, we have a lot of interest in this because it's easy to run, easy to operate, and you built-in security at all these levels. But one of the nice features of that is with Chrome OS, it's tied to Chrome devices. And with Chrome devices, you get those sort of that lower total cost of operating from the cheaper hardware, or from the more cost-effective hardware. But you also gives you the ability to have a broader set of use cases. So you can have the one device in each room or on carts that anybody with the right identity can log into, and your session follows you from location to location. And when you have tools like Chrome Enterprise, which allows you to do large-scale enterprise management of the devices, coupled with identity, you have a world in which, if you lose the device, you haven't lost the data on the device, because all the data is stored in cloud. Your identity, your session, doesn't persist past your login. And so one of the things that we find is that you could actually have a world where every day you come in and you operate on a brand new device every single day, and you would have the same experience. So you could just show up, they hand you a device for the day, you use that. It's a really powerful capability in a world where there's a lot of movement, a lot of mobility, and you want to reduce the risk of devices being lost and causing data leak, because sort of laptop loss is certainly a common cause of healthcare privacy breaches. This is just an example. Chapters Health System actually went and purchased 1.2 million commercial Chromebooks. A lot of their interest around this was how fast they were to operate, how easy they were to boot up, but also reducing the number of times they have to log in, eliminating the need for a VPN to access a lot of their systems. Doctor.com also deployed Chrome devices in their in the practices that they were supporting to give people an easy way, secure way to fill in forms, which were then the results of which were captured in Google Sheets, and they could then just move the device from patient to patient, and they're cleared between instances. Now, as I was talking about, the benefit of having Chrome devices is that you have these single sign-ons, but you also they usefully tie in with this concept of what Google is called Beyond Corp. The idea that, as I was emphasizing before, you don't want to rely on your network being the source of truth as to your identity. So the ability to say that how are we going to do security decoupled from your networking connection. So how can I access my application without having to go through a VPN? And so Google has externalized these ideas as a tool called IdentityAware Proxy. And the IdentityAware Proxy sits in front of your internal applications and allows you to authenticate users' access to that application without going through a VPN. So you stand this up in front of your applications, you go to log in, and then it authenticates you using using sort of your internal security tools for your identity management. And this is then also frequently coupled with strong authentication. So the idea that you would have two-factor authentication, which allows you to have phishing-resistant accounts, and when you couple that with auditing and logging tools, you have much better insight into who is accessing your tools, from where, and the capabilities. So when you think about this from an implementation point of view, frequently at Google, the way it works is, I've got my account, my identity, and I've got a password, but I also have a security key, which is uniquely assigned to me. And if I want to go access an application, instead of logging into a VPN and entering my password, I can go directly to the application, I log in, but then I'm prompted to, tap on my security key to prove that I am who I am. And this is valuable because if, someone sends me an email and I'm phished and I, give out my password, nobody can still access the resources I had access to with just my password. They also have to have that security key that I carry around with me. So broadly, Google's really trying to keep ahead of the new threats that we're seeing in the community. Our customers are continually reaching out to us with new requirements across geography as well as verticals. Healthcare has really driven a lot of the thinking that I'm going to talk about lately. And part of this is that Google has, multiple applications that serve more than 1 billion users each. And what that means is that Google is protecting the data for 1 billion plus users, and we're able to take the security practices that we've developed internally to protect that data and make them available to the larger community to protect their own data. We've been making significant investments in both our hardware, network infrastructure, almost 31 billion over the past 3 years. And when you couple that with that leading team of security engineers and researchers, you know that there's going to be continuous investment and we will be at the forefront. And broadly, there's a significant amount of community engagement that's happening in terms of open source contributions. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. There's an open source program called Forseti, specifically looking at security tools for Google, for which there are a lot of contributions are being made, as well as significant amount of research going into high impact vulnerability in research. And one of the things I want to talk about is there's a Project Zero team at Google. And the goal of this team is to identify security risks before they're known. So looking at, finding these, risk factors, these vulnerabilities that nobody else knows about, and then being able to prepare ourselves in advance of them actually becoming threats. So, this Project Zero team was among the first to discover the Heartbleed, Spectre, Meltdown. And because of those discoveries, Google was able to patch and adapt our systems to protect all of our customers before they were even publicly known as vulnerabilities. Lydia Long talked about this in the aftermath of the Spectre Meltdown, citing Google as the one with the clearest, most comprehensive customer communications for how to respond to these vulnerabilities. Oh, sorry, wrong button. There we go. So now I want to transition to talking a little bit about controls. Broadly, most of you are probably familiar with this, that cloud security requires collaboration. And this is the same is true for compliance. Google's responsible for securing our infrastructure. You're responsible for securing your data and who has access to that data. But we help by managing, depending, where we are in the stack, including best practices, templates, and a wide grouping of products and solutions to help with that as well. But when you think about this, at the one end you have, infrastructure as a service, where things like compute engine and cloud storage, where a lot of the security management compliance there is on your end. Google does a fair bit of that, but there's, the burden of the shared responsibility is a little bit more on the customer. Where you go to the other end with something like Gmail and Drive, where Google is really owning much more of the IT security management. So I think it's important to emphasize that in the end, security, compliance, it's a shared responsibility, and it's just important to be aware of where that level, where you are in the amount of sharing that has to happen. One of the tools I want to talk about, I mentioned that we're providing products and solutions. One of the tools that we've made available is a tool called the Data Loss Prevention API. And what this is this is a product which is designed to find personally identifiable information in data. And then that tool can be used to redact or transform that data. So this is an example here of some notes where they included a name, credit card number, phone number, email, and these were detected by the DLP API and then redacted. So the Cloud DLP API, really at a high level, you start with raw data that can be fed into the DLP API, and then that can be redacted, and then that data can be made available for analytics purposes, for the purposes of sharing with other people, as well as for application development. We're seeing a lot of interest in this in the healthcare space, particularly thinking about how do I de-risk data warehouses. For instance, you may have a research data warehouse that you're going to let your physicians work with, or your researchers work with, or maybe even medical students, and they may all, under your guidelines, have appropriate permissions to see fully identified data. But you don't have to let them see that, and they don't need to see that data. So this provides the ability to de-risk a lot of the research use cases that you see in an organization. It's also useful in application development, where if you have the application developers or the support team, they don't need to actually look at the raw data in order to be able to support the application and do future development. But the application itself, what it does is it provides you with a flexible classification tool to look at a wide variety of sensitive types of data. So looking at names, social security numbers, various country identifiers, location, and you can actually customize which ones you want to detect and how, and so that it's a highly configurable tool. And then it gives you the ability to de-identify that data. So you can use it to both classify and de-identify through tools like dynamic data masking. You can do format preserving encryption. So if you wanted to continue to look like a social security number but not actually be a social security number, you can do that. Same thing with credit cards, as well as a variety of other transformations. Coupled with this, it has tools for re-identification risk, so being able to calculate the k-anonymity of the data. So for instance, if you have one column and that column of data is job title, and the vast majority of job titles say software engineer, that's great, but one of those job titles is CEO of Google, that's a fairly identifying indicator. And so knowing that only appears once in your data set is a area of concern. So you can iterate through these processes. You can also supply custom dictionaries. So if, for instance, you wanted to supply a dictionary of all your physicians' names to make sure that they are detected. Same thing with custom regular expressions. And this so the PII classification engine that is available in the DLP API is also what powers Gmail's data loss prevention tools, which are highly configurable. So the idea that you can actually set this up in Gmail to say, quarantine all my emails that include a credit card number or include a social security number as a way to prevent data leakage. So this is a quick demo here of an application that we mocked up to show some of the capabilities of what might be possible, looking at a clinical note being evaluated in real time, and going from so redaction. So you see there it changed it from transformations to just saying these are the different identifiers, or you can go to de-identify where it's doing transformation. So doing name substitution, doing date shifting throughout the data set. And there are just a couple different example notes showing how this works. And so we've done a lot of work with the DLP API team, as well as providing some healthcare-specific enhancements for some of the model training, particularly because there are both the context of the data and the meaning in clinical notes may be different depending on the use case. Many of you have probably heard about the Cloud Healthcare API. We announced it, launched to alpha this week. We had announced it initially back at HIMSS earlier last year. And the goal of that is to make it easy to ingest healthcare data right now with the focus around EHR data as well as imaging data into what we call a healthcare data set. And we currently support a wide variety of data types, HL7v2, FHIR, DICOM. And one of the things that we're trying to leverage with the DLP API is to make it easy for you to apply those de-identification tools to these data sets. So basically adding de-identification as a native transformation of these data sets to give you that, ultimately start with an identified data set and end up with a de-identified data set. Now, it's important to emphasize that no de-identification process is perfect. And so you will have to make your own, risk evaluation before you share it, but it's a very powerful tool if you want to reduce the risk of this data. And this is important because a lot of the use cases that people have for this data is they want to be able to join this with other data types, but you don't want to necessarily join on the PII, or you want to export it for other people to work with, assuming you're comfortable with the level of de-identification that's happened. And this is important, so if you want to have a research data warehouse where you're looking at, population health, and you want to allow people to ask questions without destroying a lot of the value in the data. But it's also important for machine learning training because, as people build models, you don't want to be building machine learning models on fully identified data sets because you don't want to take a chance that you're encoding PII into the model itself. I want to change gears a little bit to talk now about Cloud Security Command Center, which is a relatively new product on the cloud that really helps you gather data and identify threats about your environment and then act on them before they become actual sources of damage or loss. You can see the Cloud Security Command Center here is part of the Cloud Console platform where you get visibility into your data as well as your services, can generate powerful security insights, and then it's important because it's a flexible platform, so you can plug in other capabilities to it and extend it as well. What you're seeing here is, some of the visibility you get into your cloud assets with the Cloud Security Command Center. This is the asset inventory where you can see, all the different, all the different cloud resources that you have provisioned, and you can go drill down into them. How many do I have? What's new? What's deleted? And really get a higher level insight. One of the things that I've, a lot of people have found with a lot of the problems with IT is that you oftentimes, you can have sort of these shadow IT infrastructures that that people don't have insight into. So, you have someone who's creating resources and you don't know those, virtual machines exist. You don't know these storage locations exist. And this gives you visibility into everything in your organization. There are also tools to be able to detect where your sensitive data is, so the Data Loss Prevention API integrates with this. You can also use anomaly detection to look for anomalous activity or behavior around your resources, and that ultimately enables you to take action against those risks that you detect. Cloud Security Command Center gives you the ability to identify a number of key cloud security risks, whether it's sensitive data that you need to have better controls around through the DLP integrations. Looking for public storage buckets. There are a lot of security breaches that have happened over the past year or so where someone misconfigured a storage bucket and left it available for everyone to look at. Looking at who's modifying my resources. Are the permissions changing? Who's doing that? Why? Also, being able to scan for known application vulnerabilities, misconfigured access policies. Does this data set have too broad an access permission landscape for what it should have, as well as monitoring for external threats. I also mentioned that it's a relatively flexible platform, so it integrates with a number of security tools, which I've already touched on. Cloud Security Scanner is another one of those tools. But it also allows you to incorporate insights from a number of our partners, and able to do that through a REST API that it provides. And I'm highlighting here a number of the detectors and integrations that exist with Cloud Security Command Center right now. So internally, we have the DLP API, we have Security Scanner, Forseti Security, which we talked about a little bit earlier with that open source collection of tools that's really focused on GCP, as well as Google Anomaly Detection. But we also have many partners for whose capabilities you can integrate very directly into Cloud Security Command Center. When you think about the different security program activities, you as a security officer or a member of a security team might be thinking about, there are a large number of them. I'm not going to walk through every single one of these, because we wouldn't have enough time. But when you think about it at high level, you've got identity and access management, application security, infrastructure security, security operations, thinking about your endpoints, data, network, governance, risk compliance. These are all areas of focus that you need to be thinking about, that there are going to be a variety of different approaches you take. And at Google, what we've done is we've actually providing products and offerings for you for each one of these capabilities. Thinking about what are the how can we help you address all of these individual categories in your day-to-day operations across GCP, G Suite, as well as endpoints and devices. In addition to that, we know that we You also probably have partners that you prefer to work with, that you work closely with, that add other capabilities that we have not built yet. So we also work closely with a wide variety of partners in the security ecosystem to help you with each one of these cases as well. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to empower our customers to have the best security for their data. And part of what we do is we're able to leverage the proven security capabilities that we have built internally to protect the billions of users that are using Google tools and make it available as cloud product offerings. So, Uber Proxy and Beyond Corp led to IdentityAware Proxy. Hardware second factor authentication is the security key. So there's a lot of externalization of our internal security practices into tools that you can use yourselves. And I've touched upon this a little bit before, but Google continues to be an innovator in the security space, pioneering a lot of the work in zero trust computing. A lot of work has been done around certificate transparency using blockchain and public ledger to protect against certificate authority compromises as well as certificate forgery. Continued innovations in services security with Istio security. And also, thinking about the future. Well, what happens in a world where you have quantum computers, and how does that change our approach to cryptography? So Google is really doing a lot of forward thinking in that space. Now, I've talked about a lot of the capabilities that Google Cloud can provide. Let's talk a little bit about some of the specific concerns or use cases you might have, particularly in the healthcare industry. So phishing is one that is a very common concern. And 91% of cybersecurity attacks start with a phishing email. And phishing, if you're not as familiar, what this really is, this is an attempt to gain information from you through a very highly targeted approach. So, a phishing researcher will spend a lot of time doing research about you or about a class of people like you, and send a highly targeted email that looks like it's valid. It looks very similar to something that you would see, and tricking you into providing your credentials, or tricking you into downloading malware, or sharing sensitive data. And this was actually been a source of a number of losses. Here, Mattel is an example up here where their CEO was phished and led to a $3 million loss. And so what Google is able to do in this space, so Gmail has been using machine learning to find phishing emails and prevent them from ever reaching the inbox. So being able to identify them and just classify them as a danger and not deliver them directly to the inbox. Chrome browser is enabled, is aware to warn you before clicking on suspicious links. And security keys, I talked about this earlier as part of second factor authentication. The idea, so let's say I do get phished and I give you my password. It doesn't matter because you can't access my data, because that's protected by a second factor authentication as well. Ransomware. Again, this is I think probably one that's pretty familiar in the healthcare space, especially when you think about the WannaCry attacks from last year, where the National Health Service in the UK was basically taken offline for a number of days. And what that meant is physicians went back to pen and paper for working with people in the hospital systems. What happened, patients were basically, appointments were canceled, people were told not to come in, people were turned away. And basically, at a high level said, only seek medical help if you have an emergency. This was a huge problem, and they were actually fortunate to get out of this by someone discovering a way to get around WannaCry. And this comes back to this the statement that taking healthcare systems offline has real patient safety impact, which is why these areas tend to be targets. And when we think about what can be done in this space, again, Gmail is using machine learning to identify the types of emails that might be classified as triggers for ransomware. When you think about data storage and drive, the data is stored in the cloud, so it can be protected from ransomware outbreaks. Particularly, it's a little bit more difficult. You can't just encrypt it locally on the disk, but it also means it doesn't move from device to device in the same way that local work does. And Chrome browser will, help you, not go to suspected sites that are sites that are suspected of hosting ransomware. I mean, it's not a perfect guarantee, but they have a lot of insights into what are places that are dangerous and can warn you about that. And then Chrome OS devices really limit the spread of ransomware from device to device as well. Data exfiltration, again. So that this is the idea that you're worried about either human error or a malicious insider taking data out from your system. We've touched on a lot of the capabilities already in this talk that can be useful here. The Data Loss Prevention API to help you identify what your where your sensitive data is and who has access to it. So identity and access management allows you to control who has access to those sets of data. So you can say, well, I know that this is sensitive data, so only people with this role should have access to this data set. The same thing with the VPC service controls allow you to set up secure access zones for handling sensitive data. And Forseti, as we talked about, actually enables you to set up security rules that can be, basically so that you can ensure that they're set up and deployed correctly from the start, and then make sure that you're only being changed by the right people. What you hear about is, and this is again, something you hear about a lot, is like these misconfigured storage leading to a lot of these leaks. So understanding, what are the right access controls that you need, being aware of who has access to all of your different storage locations is really important. Secure access. This comes back to the topic of I want to be able to access my data from anywhere. We're seeing in the especially in the healthcare community, there's a great deal of mobility, whether it's inside the hospital, but increasingly physicians also want to be able to access this data at home. You're on call at night, you want to be able to log into the system relatively easily without having to go into the hospital. It's an important capability for telehealth so that you can actually view data from home or from remote locations. And generally, having the ability to have secure access off-site, makes it easier for people to do their jobs. People are a little bit happier. And Google has a wide variety of capabilities there. So I talked about cloud identities. So you can, give people their identities and help people understand who has the right roles and permissions to access different resources. IdentityAware Proxy gives you the ability to put this proxy layer in front of your applications. So that way you have to, you don't have to have everyone set up a VPN on their device that basically just punches a hole into, your outer shell, because you don't have any, like if that device is lost and the VPN is on there, you've just introduced a new vector of attack into your system. And Chrome OS devices, device management, enterprise management, I've talked a lot about this already, but when you have these devices which are easy to manage at scale, have the security capabilities built in, and you couple them with the IdentityAware Proxy and good identity controls, it gives you the ability to let people access data remotely where you have good view of who's accessing the data and what they're doing with it. Security monitoring. I spent a lot of time talking about how do you prevent security threats. Part of that is actually just ongoing monitoring of understanding, what threats, are there active attempts on my system, or if somehow they manage to disguise the fact that they've got into this, how are you going to do the forensics afterwards? What tools do you have to look into what happened and how you can reconstruct that behavior so you can really understand what to do about that? I highlighted Cloud Security Command Center as one of those tools. G Suite also has a security center for this type of monitoring. Forseti is a powerful tool, as well as a number of our partners in the space, including Palo Alto, Cloudflare, and Redlock. Another important area of attack is the distributed denial of service, where a bad actor is going to take down your website, your application, your capabilities by flooding you with requests and basically making it unable for you to serve your application. So you can imagine a world where perhaps you've exposed external APIs to your medical record system or to your scheduling or billing system, and those can be overwhelmed by external requests. And people can say, well, we're going to keep this up until you pay our ransom. So Google actually has a number of capabilities to help people with this. First, the massive network infrastructure is able to scale up and absorb a lot of these DDoS attacks without really any intervention required on your part. We also have a tool called GCP Armor that can selectively protect at application level by blocking unwanted traffic from certain locations, as well as a number of partner solutions that are available that are easy to deploy. So in the last couple of minutes here, I want to transition to talking about compliance, because it wouldn't be a healthcare talk if I didn't spend any time talking about compliance. One of the things I really want to emphasize most, and it's really important to clarify, is the data that you put into Google Cloud is your data. You own that data. You control how that data is used. We're not scanning that data to provide advertisements. We're not selling that data to third parties. We're not doing data mining on that data. We are not building machine learning models on that data. You control that data. And if you want to delete that data, you can delete that data, and we provide assurances for how quickly that data will be removed. We're very clear about all these details in our data processing terms. As part of our terms of service, you can go see what restrictions we have on how we process it, who our third-party audits and certifications are, learn more about the incident notifications in the event of a data incident, also learn a little bit more about our security measures and who the sub-processors are. As we think about that concept of data being your data, one of the things that we want to do is make sure that you have transparency into that. And we launched an application earlier this year called Access Transparency. And what Access Transparency does is it gives you insight, including an immutable audit trail of actions taken by Google engineers or support whenever they do have to interact with your data. So if someone at Google has to interact with that data, you'll get an audit record of that for those applications. And when you combine that with cloud audit logs, you have a much more comprehensive view of the administrative activity that happens in your environment. Here's an example of what an Access Transparency log looks like. And really what it's telling you is, what piece of data was accessed, where it was accessed from, and why it was accessed. So you can see up top there, so the product was cloud storage. This was the resource that was accessed. It was accessed from the United States, and the reason was customer initiated support, and there's the ticket number. So you get all this detail, so you feel confident in understanding why this access occurred. This is a typical workflow you might see, where you have a customer who's looking at data in one of their buckets and realizes, my data looks like it's been corrupted. I'm going to call support to find out what happened. The support person, says, okay, I'm going to go look at your data. Is given access to that, looks at it and agrees, yes, your data looks corrupted. And you can see right there in the log that this support engineer actually looked at your data. And he says, okay, well, I'm going to escalate this to an engineer who has a more sophisticated debugging tool. And when that engineer accesses it, that also generates a log to give you that insight of when the data is being touched. Ultimately, what we were trying to do is build trust through transparency. And how do we do this? First of all, we spend a lot of time writing detailed technical white papers and providing compliance certifications so that you know that what we say we do is actually what we're doing. We do publish a transparency report related to government and legal actions. And we offer cloud audit logs to help you understand what your administrators are doing in terms of accessing data, as well as access transparency, so you have insight into what Google administrators would have to do with if they ever have to touch your data. As I said before, we provide a number of third-party audits and certifications. You can come see these here. I want to spend a minute or two just talking about HIPAA. This is healthcare. Google Cloud Platform and G Suite do support HIPAA compliance, which means that you can build HIPAA-compliant workloads on top of GCP and use G Suite in a HIPAA-compliant fashion. We publish implementation guides to help you understand how to do this, as well as what your responsibilities are in terms of how you're using and operating these in a HIPAA-compliant fashion. And one of the things that's important is we're able to do this because of Google's internal security processes and measures. And because of the high standard that we hold ourselves to, we didn't have to do anything special in terms of new security features or provisions to achieve HIPAA compliance. And what that means is that you can use these tools in any region. You can use any of the instances. So it's not like if you're using Google Compute Engine, there aren't just specific VMs that are approved for this. It's the whole scope of that application. We already take advantage of encryption by default, so you don't have to do that. And we sign an enterprise-grade BAA, which means that if your organization signs a BAA with Google, it covers all of your organization's projects. You don't have to selectively designate that this project is a HIPAA project and this one is not. And importantly, there's no upcharge. Because all of our security, we have this level of security for ourselves all the time. We don't have to we're not passing on any costs for an added capability. And this is my last slide. I'm actually really excited. There was a lot of interest in the healthcare community over the past year, really asking us to get HITRUST certification. So we went out and we did that. I was excited to announce that earlier this year, we did receive Trust CSF certification. You can read more about that on our website. And with that, I will thank you for your time. I appreciate many of you who made the hike over from West, if you were accidentally directed there. I'll hang around for any Q&A over here if anybody has any questions, but I got to make room for whoever's going to be on the stage after me. So thank you very much.